So thanks for the invitation and thanks for the kind introduction, which unfortunately was not free of exaggerations. So Bewusstseinskultur means that you take an ethical stance toward your own mental states. That is, in ethics, which is a subdiscipline of philosophy, you would ask, what makes an action a good action? And philosophers think about it. This is not substituting classical ethics, it just adds a little bit. We ask the same question about states of consciousness. What is a good state of consciousness? Do we know this? Can this be answered? Maybe nobody can know this, but what we do is we take an ethical stance also in our own lives toward our own phenomenology, our mental states. Then, if we have come to the conclusion what valuable states actually are, we systematically cultivate them, first on an individual level. Your answer to what a valuable state of consciousness is might be different from my answer. So there's all kinds of diversity and openness there. I don't think it's really possible to nail down what the best states of consciousness are, but maybe you disagree and maybe we can come back to this in the discussion. And then we need a process of enculturation in the societal context, and that has to be rational and evidence-based. That's where philosophy comes in, with conceptual clarity and empirical science for the evidence base. So this has a long history. In the English language, you can just find a little bit about this in chapter 9 of this older book, The Ego Tunnel, and in the epilogue of the Elephant Book. This also is not a new idea. Many people have thought about this in different ways for many centuries, and I usually bring just this one example from Cicero before Christ. Philosophers have always asked themselves what it really means to love wisdom. Philosophers, we even have a peer-reviewed journal that's called Metaphilosophy, where own professional philosophers only write papers about what philosophy is for years, right? So one definition in these ancient times was cultura autem animi philosophia est. It means taking care and cultivating the soul. Pflege der Seele aber ist die Philosophie. So that's an example, and we see there's a long tradition. Now, 6 concrete examples. Which states of consciousness, if any, should be illegal? You all know this, that we have advanced mind-altering technologies. In the time where most of you live your life, you're going to see things that you still cannot imagine. You're going to have high-resolution avatars with perfect voice and a knowledge base which will be a better friend than any of the friends you've had in your real life. The metaverse is exploding. You know all this. Many of the techniques that come out of the confluence of virtual reality and AI will be mind-altering technologies. And of course, this will also be fused with neurotechnology. So there's something coming there. And the question is, should some of these things be illegal? And then, of course, the question you have all asked yourself many times, what would be a rational and ethically defensible drug policy for the future? I'm going to show this 3 times today, but the situation is that about 20 to 30 years ago, when people talked about the drug problem, this was 12 to 15 molecules, right? They were talking about. Now it's 1,047 molecules. It was in 2020. So the new psychoactive substances on the market have exploded. A little more about this later. So another example is the attention extraction economy. I guess you all know what that means. We have people say we will have basically 3 encounters with AI. The first encounter has gone terribly wrong. It's the algorithm-based extraction of human attention from brains packaging it and selling it to customers. And we see that since about 2006, democracies all over the planet disintegrate and go down. This has directly something to do with surveillance capitalism, social networks, which are constantly optimized. So what is really being monetized in AI-driven social media is not just attention, but destruction of mental autonomy. The game that is being played in for a long time is who controls the focus of your attention, this research of this biological brain. You, this individual, or some American tech company. That's the game, and you know who's losing and you know who's winning. You all know it. That is a topic for Bewusstseinskultur. A third example, animal ethics. This is a great year. You hear a lot about Immanuel Kant in 2024. He who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with man. We can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals. So what states of consciousness, if any, can we force upon animals, non-human animals? That's a typical question of Bewusstseinskultur, of the ethics of consciousness. Now, I don't know, you all know what synthetic biology is, but maybe some of you haven't heard this concept of synthetic phenomenology. Another question is, what states of consciousness, if we get into the vicinity, should we force upon machines? That's a related question, actually. And I could easily give you 3 talks on this, because in 2020, I have demanded a global moratorium until 2050 because I'm very nervous. Some people in my research community, in the consciousness community, would have no hesitations of creating artificial consciousness, and there's a high risk of creating artificial suffering. When I worked from 2018 to 2020 in Brussels, we created these documents, the high-level expert group, the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and the policy and investment recommendations. And this was an issue that was completely banned. The industrial lobby didn't want it because they thought it ruins markets and it makes customers nervous. And most of the AI experts says that's total science fiction. You know, there were just 2 people in the group who said artificial consciousness is a major upcoming problem. One was a guy with green hair by the name of Jan Tallinn, who invented Skype. And the other was me. And this was banned from the document. Now we have the AI Act, you know, all this, the European AI law. There are no lethal autonomous weapon systems in there anymore. And of course, artificial consciousness is not in there. But now all the scientists are getting very nervous. This is just from last December in Nature. The consciousness community is approaching the AI community and says we have to talk. This is getting urgent. There is something possibly developing, and we have no tests. Of course, we wouldn't know if a machine has phenomenal states. That's an aspect. Another aspect is, what states of consciousness do we want to show our children? Practical question, which meditation techniques comprise the essential set that any child should know? I would say any child has the right to be introduced into a set of basic meditation techniques. And it's not easy. I'm working in a group with experts, depends on what age, it depends on brain development, actually. This is meaningful. But this is a question for Bewusstseinskultur. How do we integrate contemplative practice into the educational system so that every child has access to these possibilities? It's actually a duty of care of the state. I don't know if you've ever thought about in what state of consciousness you would like to die yourself, but of course a culture of dying is also a part of Bewusstseinskultur. And the question in the background is, of course, if some aspects of the dying process can be practiced safely. For instance, through peaceful ego dissolution via advanced meditation practice, or, as you all know, through smoking 5-methoxy DMT and stuff like that. So ego dissolution is something you can experience before you die. And the question is if there could be a new culture of preparing for this final transition. This is, of course, also a question of Bewusstseinskultur. Now, there are two wider contexts, and I just want to briefly mention them. One is that we are, as you all know, escalating planetary crisis. I don't know if some of you have had these thoughts that I have. I'm a bit afraid how 2024 and 2025 will play out, how the situation will be 24 months from now. Many different factors are accelerating right now, and that's part of the problem. All this, the things we are thinking about and the things we're trying and the things we're practicing happen in a special historical context. The unfolding climate catastrophe, but also the complete restructuring of the global world order, you know it all. So that's part of the wider context, but there's also another thing behind this idea. This is not only about animal rights and how to use psychedelics properly. There is a bigger question in the background, namely if anything like a secular spirituality could actually exist. That's a great difference between the psychedelic scene in Europe and that in America, because the last time Henrik and I met in medicine in the US, we saw that what is called the psychedelic renaissance looks very different in the US, and nobody likes the idea of a secular spirituality there. Very evangelical, you know. So there are cultural differences here. I have annoyed a lot of people by saying three things. The opposite of religion is not science, but spirituality. The ethical principle of intellectual honesty, intellektuelle Redlichkeit, can be analyzed in a special case of practice of the spiritual stance. And in the purest form of spirituality and science, they come from the same, more normative root. A little more about this in the book. I'm not going to go into it. Those people who are interested in this, there's an open access paper on the web called Spirituality and Intellectual Honesty, where you can also read this in English. So one word, and Kant again, about intellectual honesty, and then I will not speak about this anymore today. So intellectual honesty is a very simple thing. It's just the intention to be radically honest with yourself, nothing else. It's something very simple, everybody understands. So called it the sincere intention of being honest towards oneself in his work Die Religion in den Grenzen der bloßen Vernunft, 1793. And the interesting thing is you don't always have to manage. You know, we don't manage to be honest with ourselves. I don't. But you should at least have the intention and the sincerity of the intention. That's what counts. And that nobody, you cannot fake it. Either you have that sincerity or you don't. So in the old days, he's even said that's the idea of the moral good in its absolute purity. Die Idee des sittlich Guten in seiner absoluten Reinigkeit. That's how it was called at the time. And I think this is lacking in two major social movements. It's lacking in the gigantic movements, spiritual movements around the planet, but it's also lacking in parts of the climate movement. but that would be another talk. Here's a more modern version of what intellectual honesty is. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Was sich überhaupt sagen lässt, lässt sich klar sagen, und worüber man nicht reden kann, darüber muss man schweigen. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. That's a completely different take, but it's the same idea. And now I want to turn to a concrete example, namely psychedelics, and tell you how I see the current situation, and I told you you wouldn't like it. So any general legalization, that's the dilemma. We have a dilemma. We have a false alternative here. I'm against the legalization of LSD, right? Because I think a general legalization would be something that is much too simple, much too cheap, and be very dangerous. Because if we would do that, the general population is just not ready for it. If we don't come up with a real cultural innovation, if we don't have an intelligent form of regulation and the social infrastructure, right? That's where we're all here for it, then it's not an option. So in applied ethics, you want to optimize the risk-benefit ratio for everybody. A full legalization of the main hallucinogens would knowingly worsen the current risk-benefit ratio. That's not an alternative. But any perpetuation of the current status quo is, of course, also deeply unethical. It has been deeply unethical for decades to keep going, and it's also irrational. Namely, it's impractical. From a practical perspective, it doesn't work. So why is that? New causal factors, 1,047 new substances, will increase the number of adverse reactions. You will have people in emergency wards. You have them now, where the doctors haven't even heard the name of the molecule in their whole study or when they come in. If we simply do nothing, that's called ostrich politics, Vogel-Strauß-Politik, as we've been doing for decades. This is going to get worse. It's not getting better. It's not staying the same. The risk-benefit ratio deteriorates. So what do we do in a situation like this? Let's have a second look. So in Europe, if you look at the numbers in Europe, in 2022, we had 880 new psychedelic, psychoactive substances that were confiscated for the first time. In 2014 was the peak year. It was the first year where there were more than 100 new compounds. And the UN numbers say it was 11 and 27 new psychoactive substances that were first confiscated between 2009 and 2021. So we have slept on this so long, now the situation is completely out of control. At least I would claim this. So why is that the case? There are no financial incentives for anybody to change this. Why is this? There is no industrial lobby that will really support an enculturation of psychedelics. Another thing is that the overall prevalence levels of LSD have been, most people don't believe it, because it's people who are just taking a lot right now in their lives. But if you look at the numbers, it's low and stable for a number of years. Those people in the drug community that take substances like LSD, 2CB, psilocybin, is in every new generation that comes, it's about 1%. And it doesn't change much. You cannot make money with these people. It's just no market. You see it here. It's, for instance, for mushrooms and LSD, it's below 1% for a long time. The diagnostic scope in which we all believe for therapeutic interventions may turn out to be slower than we think. The verdict is still open, But people who really want to make money, they're not so much interested in this. Then it would be unrealistic to expect that any substantial and fair-minded initiative comes out of the business sector. I think the business sector, a lot of investors around, but an honest, fair-minded initiative is not coming out of that sector. Let's look at the political sector. The idea of developing, can you imagine this THC legalization? How ridiculous and how many decades, you know? The idea of developing an evidence rational approach is extremely unattractive to politicians because the number of voters in an ethanol culture, is very small. But the risk of damaging your reputation is very, very high. In Germany, the first person to say something meaningful about interesting substances like LSD or psilocybin will have Markus Söder jumping on him, and we have this thing. So most politicians never had any psychedelic experience. They lack any personal intuition about the benefits or risks. They just see it in terms of their career. Political institutions, I think, cannot realistically be expected to really help with the enculturation problem. And it would be really naive, I think, that the necessary form of cultural innovation comes out of the governmental sector. So that's aspect number 2. Business sector will not work, governmental sectors. Do you know what the Mikado problem is? Whoever moves first loses. So there's actually a political disincentive to move for young politicians, who still have a shaky career. On the other hand, there is this ongoing constant emergency, right? Accidents are happening, you know it all. Unsafe situations, unclear dosages, impurities, all that. And it gets worse, but all these personal tragedies, which never show up in any official statistics, and the psychiatric suffering caused by untreated adverse reaction, is the price we pay. And that price for politicians is a rational price to pay. It's not that people haven't thought about it, but for decades, they pay the price with those people who end up in psychiatry or get more serious problems for their own career. So there is a positive reward for cynicism in the field of drug policy, I claim. There's an actual incentive to act unethical for politicians. Knowingly sacrificing the well-being of mostly younger citizens in the favor of safety of one's own political career is a stable, risk-reducing strategy for politicians who want to get somewhere. So it's not going to come from there. Now, the general population. I live far away in the countryside. I talk to game wardens and farmers. They lack any personal intuition about what this could be or how good could this be. They would never see psychedelics as something they could profit from, but they have been exposed to decades of fear-mongering in the media. I think the general population, we have to be honest with ourselves, all they have is this slippery slope intuition. They think, if it helps some people, it's okay, but if we fully integrate this into society, it's going to, go down the drain. Dammbruch argument, we say in Germany, So without majority support amongst the general public, chances for solving the enculturation problem by civil society, I would agree, remain slim. You may have encountered this as well. If you talk to normal with good arguments, they will also say some things like, haven't we got bigger problems like this on the planet right now? Like making psychedelics available for a small elite in this society. And they have some point, I think. So then there is the fourth aspect, what in ethics we call the pacing gap. The pacing gap is that the technological developments are much faster than professional ethicists and lawmakers can follow them, right? Think of artificial intelligence. Here we have the same thing. The technological landscape for psychoactive substance has become very complex and rich over the last 30 years. And even those parts of governments and civic societies who really want to respond to this development, it's just too fast. So again, there is a psychological incentive for ostrich politics. In the majorities of the societies of the planet, actually solving this problem is not even a conceivable outcome. Think about Russia, think about China, you know. Large populations on the planet. It wouldn't even be possible to close the pacing gap. But on the other hand, there's a systems competition on the planet. You know, there are many different societies, and the question is which society will win, actually. There's an opportunity to lead this process in a global way, and we'll see this. Somebody is going to take the lead. So, what's the enculturation problem for the special case of psychedelics? Autonomous citizens in open society must have a way to enter the psychedelic state space legally and safely. That's even a basic human right. There's no discussion about it. Ethically, we are obliged, the state is obliged to optimize the risk-benefit ratio for doing this, for harm reduction. And we have this problem for applied ethics and law, which is how can the psychedelic experience be culturally integrated so that you maximize the benefit and minimize the damage. Nothing woo-woo about it, very rational, very dry. How do you integrate this technology so you maximize the benefit and minimize the damage? So there are deeper issues. I think Christoph Bublitz in Germany has argued this. There should be a human right to mental self-determination in our constitution. Think about the discussion about the cannabis legalization again. How realistic is this? That just because it's an important idea and a rational idea, this will ever get into our constitution. So we have a socio-cultural gridlock. At the same time, we have time pressure. You know, there's this large number of new substances and global society is just not ready for it. And I have an empirical prediction. The risk-benefit ratio for illegal psychoactive substances and for psychedelics in particular will continue to deteriorate. This is getting worse, I think. In 1989, I did this interview with Albert Hoffmann, and small part appeared in the Taz. A little larger excerpt is in the Elephant Book. And he said many things I didn't like at that time. You know, for instance, he said, it probably takes time. I hated him for this when I was talking to him. But he said it's probably, because it's such a potent substance, it's probably a long process and we have to be very patient, and it may take generations, actually, until, as he said, we should quietly let the knowledge of the right application grow. Maybe that was right. I don't know. I still think it's a bit ambitious, but maybe it's just pure wisdom. So what we really need is, again, genuine Bewusstseinskultur, right? And the central difficulty is that three parts have strong incentives to behave unethically. Political institutions have an incentive to behave unethical, that thousands of young people run terrible risks, you know, and have dangers and accidents and everything. And the same is true for the legal and for the illegal business sector. They don't want a rational Bewusstseinskultur in the field of science to appear. So it's a bit of a problem. That's the central difficulty. And I think that for these reasons, I have just kept any new promising initiatives are far more likely to come out of civil society itself than from anywhere else. And that is why we have this new institution here. And I would hope that exactly this forum and this new institution will, serve to create the necessary intelligence and the debates and the discussions we need, because nobody else will do it if not people like us do it. The second part of my talk is equally annoying but shorter. What is insight? This thing is called the Insight Forum, right? But what is insight? Einsicht. So here's a definition. It's a sudden form of Erkenntnisfortschritt. No inference involved. It just happens suddenly, sudden epistemic gain. There very often insights have a quality of profundity, all right? Very often insights are not just any insight, but they have a high relevance. And they lead to a shift in your general perspective on everything else very often. At the same time, they are mostly non-conceptual, nicht begrifflich, and intuitive. One can argue that there are conceptual insights, for instance, with genius mathematicians or logicians, but mostly it is something that has absolutely nothing to do with theories, words, or concepts, right? And the second thing that is important is that there's a distinct phenomenology of insight. To have a sudden insight is something that feels in a certain way, an aha experience. And that has two main components. One component is what philosophers call transparency. Transparency means that a conscious representation is not experienced as a representation, right? You all think you're sitting in a room here, right? You're not. This is a model in your brain. But that model is so good that it is transparent and you don't experience it as a model. Now, insights have the same quality. The knowledge you get is seemingly direct and immediate. You don't think about it. There's no argument. There's no mental representation. You just see this, right? And there is even very often a phenomenology of knowing that one knows. It's not only knowing this, but there's an element of certainty, Gewissheit, indubitability. You just know that you know this, and maybe you see it for the first time. But my main point in this talk in the second half is that, as philosophers say, insights need independent epistemic justification. You need a second source of science or rational argument or culture that validates that it really was an insight or successful therapy or something like this. You cannot just claim knowledge because you had this experience. Let me explain this a little bit. I talked to Gemini. Gemini says this. Insights have deeper understanding, they have hidden revelations, they change your perspective, and something I haven't mentioned before, they lead to a kind of knowledge that's actionable, where you can really practically change your own life after this. So that's what the AI says. And let us look at the problem with this, because there is a problem. You can have the phenomenology of knowing, and you have the phenomenology of insight without it being any insight. Don't know about you, be sometimes 2 days after a psychedelic experience, you've looked at your notes and found deep insights, like in my case, saying, Ich bin ich, on the notepad, or very clever logical insights also, that from the fact that you are paranoid right now, it does not follow that they're not there to get you, right? That doesn't follow, actually. So you can get very subtle thoughts. So we know a robust phenomenology of knowing in psychiatric syndromes, but also in everyday self-deception. In many different altered states of consciousness, you get deep insights, a phenomenology of insight without knowledge. And I just want to look at one special case today. You may not know, but you may have heard of it, are ecstatic epileptic seizures. Seizures where people have deep insight, bliss, and certainty before the epileptic seizure starts. Maybe some of you know Dostoevsky wrote about this. So the point is, we know many situations in which phenomenology of having a deep, relevant, profound insight can appear without any epistemic gain, right? And we have to be aware of this. So these are electrodes in brains of epileptic patients in Geneva who experience ecstatic epileptic seizures and who have deep experiences of insight and bliss. And if you look at these papers, you see that epileptic auras create in these patients sensations of hyperreality, super clarity, absolute evidence, certainty, a deep experience of understanding, insight, enlightenment, or epiphany. There are people, famous people who have said that they would give their whole life for one more second of this state. And there is this sense of certainty also. Everything seems absolutely self-evident. You know, have you had something like this in your life? This can be caused with electrode in the brain, right? If you test these people and find out where to do what, maybe before surgery, and you have electrodes. So deep, blissful insights and a sense of certainty can be caused by very local physical interactions in the brain. Intellectual honesty is not so easy, right? To face empirical evidence. And I've said a little bit more about this. You all know that the English book is freely available on the internet for all of you. And you have to learn one new word now. That's the E-fallacy, and I'm going to read it to you. That's from the glossary of terms, der E-Fehlschluss, in the book. A logical error consisting in falsely concluding that a consciously experienced feeling of knowing is a reliable indicator of actually possessing knowledge. As such, verbal reports referring to a consciously experienced signature of knowing or the intuition of just knowing do not imply or license any theoretical claims about consciousness itself, about the metaphysical nature of reality, about what is the true self, and so on, because all such claims need what I have called independent epistemic justification. you need a therapeutic process, or you have to do science, or you need rational argument. The experience itself doesn't show anything, the phenomenology. Everything else would be the fallacy. Now, one last example, and then I will already come to the end. An example that I think is very interesting for psychedelic therapy. You can guess the main point if you just read that word, placebo inside. Can you imagine the possibility that somebody causes, a therapist, causes a deep experience of insight in a therapy, and it's all wrong, and it helps? That's a placebo insight. So let's look at this. There are insight-oriented forms of psychotherapy, and many forms of psychedelic therapy share this thing that the therapist expects, if everything goes well, an insight to happen into the deeper structure of your life history. And the patient has this expectation pressure, of course, also. But then many people believe, I don't know if you ever thought about this, there's this pop psychological motive. There is unconscious material and trauma, and you have to make it conscious. And then that will heal you. Maybe you have to process it a bit. Nobody thinks, how do we know this? I mean, how do we know this? Is there, in terms of unconscious facts that can be made conscious? It's what I call the psychotherapist's ideology. Many different camps share this. Make it conscious, work through it, feel it, and then things will get better. But I mean, whoever told you, do we have that says it's like that? So this person, David Jobling, writes, it's widely believed that clients' insights must be true in order to be therapeutically effective. That's not right. You could have false insights and they could be therapeutically effective, right? And in the first sentence he says, self-exploration and insight-oriented psychotherapy leads to self-knowledge. How do we know that? That it is really self-knowledge, right? So as he says, insight-oriented psychotherapies are highly susceptible to generating placebo insights, that is, illusions, deceptions, and adaptive self-misunderstandings that convincingly mimic veridical insight but have no genuine explanatory power. So artifacts that are created in therapy or on the trip. Let's have a look at what the problem is, and then I will already come to the end. The epistemological problem, if we want to be intellectually honest in treating deep insights, is that psychedelic therapy could create pseudo-insights because there's a high expectation. The therapist has the expectation, and the patient wants to be a good patient, right? And please the therapist in some way. There could be confabulations. In this meditation study I've done, if you look in the book, there are many reports where you think, is that maybe a confabulation? Is that just the meditator's belief system that plays out, just the theory? You could have what is called iatrogenic artifacts. Do you know what iatrogenic is? Means be caused by the doctor. You feel the doctor has a certain, you trust these people, they have deep experience and they expect something that will happen. And therapeutic artifacts would be things that patient and therapist create together in the process of psychedelic therapy and trying to process it, artificial insights. And the only point I wanted to bring home today is this could be phenomenologically indistinguishable. It might feel absolutely real. And it might be exactly the same on the basis of inner experience. And that is that such pseudo-insights and illusions of self-knowledge could actually be therapeutically beneficial. like religion. There's a long tradition, the Christian church. And they could actually be, from a theoretical point of view, explanatory fictions. We want to understand, why is all of this so good? Why does it help us? It does help us, doesn't it? It helps so many people. And then we have an explanation, the insight that we have so deeply experienced. But maybe what explains the success of psychedelic therapy is not the insight phenomenology. Maybe it's something else in the process. So I think we have to be very careful there. And again, we need independent epistemic justification. Not only, but also in the therapeutic process, we need to think harder about what progress actually is, therapeutical progress, and when do we have the feeling that was a real insight? Because, for instance, it leads to sustained change of behavior. But maybe, an illusory insight, think of good Christians and wonderful religious people, could lead to sustained behavioral changes. So I would just advocate that we think about the theoretical background and the epistemology of all these experiences a little more. 4 points, and I want to highlight for a conclusion, then we're done. So, first point, what really causes the planetary crisis, which we all witness, is the deep structure of the human mind. That's what causes it. That is also what brings about political surface phenomena. And we have to look at this structure more carefully, but not only from a scientific or philosophical point of view, but using these transrational methods also will play a role in the Insight Forum, right? We have to take as many camera angles as possible. And a systematic exploration of altered states of consciousness is, of course, a way of gaining non-conceptual knowledge about the deep structure of the mind. But the question is, how do we epistemically justify this? We need, I guess, a back and forth between science, philosophy, and real practice. The most valuable states of consciousness, I think, may emerge in contemplative and psychedelic practice, but only if it is in an ethical context, if the context is actually to improve the common good and do something for other people, to alleviate human suffering, for instance. So the second point in my conclusion is there is a normative dimension. There's an ethical dimension to this whole thing we're talking about here. My third point today are, and I won't go into this again, there are some deeper questions in the background. It's not as easy as it looks. So as I have sketched in the second part of this talk, there are, for instance, some serious epistemological and methodological issues in the background. For instance, in developing tools of psychotherapy. It's not so easy. We need a little bit of theory about, for instance, what is an insight and what does insight-oriented psychotherapy really mean. So there is some deep water there, and the last point would be that the central difficulty for the special case of a Bewusstseinskultur of psychedelics is that the political institutions and both the legal and illegal business sectors have strong incentives to act unethically. They will not help. If that is true, the cultural innovation has to come out of the civil society factor. And that, I think, is why this new institution is so very important, because it can channel and create the platform for this civil society innovation. Thank you very much.